Hey, Gadi, good to have you with us. How's it
Thank
going?
you. Appreciate you having me. I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So thanks
Good,
for
good,
everyone
thanks.
who's joined. So we're here to discuss context bombs and the latest research. Do you think it's worth just doing a brief round of introductions, Gadi? I don't know. You could start.
Yeah, sure. But I would like to say just before we start, dude, your research on how agents slow down attackers, especially now when everybody's agents, like they're being careful all of a sudden and giving us back time with time to exploitation diminishing and all that stuff. I just want to stop before we even introduce ourselves and say thank you for that research. I think it's shifting security programs everywhere right now. But yeah, I'm Gadi. Pleasure to meet you all. I've been in security now for, I don't know, 25, 30 years. I've been a CISO. I had a cyber deception company before, like a decade ago, and nobody wanted cyber deception. Now they realize they have to. I've been a consultant. I've been a VC. I have another startup right now where I discover and defend agents, coding agents, co-work agents, whatever it is. And I've just been in security for many, many years now. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your kind words there, Gadi. Bruce has done some amazing work recently, so it's super cool to be able to dig into that today. I guess I can go next. So I'm Sam. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Tracebit. So as Gadi says, Tracebit, we're a deception company. We basically help people assume breach in their environment, anticipate these kind of unknown unknowns, especially as the threat landscape is changing so quickly. And we make detections using canaries or honeypots. So ways to catch attackers once they're inside the environment. And that's really what's motivated some of the research we've done on it recently.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. So I am Alessandro, but you can call me Bruce. I'm a security researcher here in Tracebit, and I'm focusing on research projects around cloud and AI security, and lately focusing specifically on how capable are agents of doing their crazy stuff on the cloud, and how those could be detected and contained and possibly disrupted, which is something that we're going to see and discuss here.
Perfect. Now we all introduce ourselves. What's next?
I guess just like housekeeping. So as people are watching, I can see everyone tuned in. If anyone has questions, obviously they can put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and address them. Perhaps it would be helpful. I can kind of give a bit of context as to what we were doing with this research, and then maybe Bruce can dig into the specifics and hopefully share a bit of behind the scenes information as well. So essentially, one of the questions we've been looking at is AI attackers. And this is obviously very, very timely with this recent Hugging Face incident. But AI attackers, how capable are they really in the environment? And so we kind of designed this range, or Bruce has designed the cyber range based in AWS. So it's got 300 plus resources. He's designed in 10 different attack paths that agents could take in that environment. And we've been essentially assessing how capable are those different models, those different agents at achieving objectives within the range. And then concretely, what is the impact of these canaries or deception that we place in the environment? Can that stop an attack? Can that hold up an attack? Can it detect the attack? And we've been trying to quantify this data. And so we first looked at this problem, candidly, we looked at it, published some results about a month ago, and we were looking at the impact of deception on the attacker. And we found some interesting results there. We found that when an attacker was concerned about deception, it reduced the rate at which they achieved the highest rate of compromise. And when you're specifically prompting that deception might be in the environment. But the overriding sense we got from those results was that the frontier agents are very capable in this environment. They would achieve compromise of the environment within 8 minutes or so, which
Yeah, that's what
obviously drives the question.
Sergey, from SysDig, right, on Unprompted, he spoke about 8 minutes to admin. That was the first, other than Anthropic talking about autonomous attacks, that was the first actual example that came out. Then the Mexican government came out. Not the researcher, Eyal Sela, came out with how the Mexican government was owned. Those were the first ones that we actually saw. They weren't fully autonomous, right? But we saw them before.
Yeah. Funny enough, that research on the 8 minutes attack, I did that research in my previous company, which was SysDig.
I mean, that's really cool.
Yeah.
I was just with Sergey on where we were with about the 1,000 CISOs or so. I don't know how many joined, talking to Hugging Face about breach and what we can learn from it. One thing that's clear that came out of the discussion is everything is just extremely fast now. It's not even about moving at machine speed. That's not enough. We have to expect everything to work differently.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it poses so many problems, right, about like how quickly you can detect these and contain them. And the canaries in our research, right, they're great at detecting the actors. But I think you do also need to say, well, what can we do to contain and act on this as quickly as possible? And so this idea came about, this idea of context bombs, which is what's got everyone so excited recently, and we're very excited to publish and talk about today. Which is basically, given that these AI agents are so quick and effective, is there anything we can do against them, like leveraging the particular fact that they are AI agents to actually not just like detect them, but like stop them in their tracks? And so we came up with this idea of context bombs, which is, can we plant within the environment these strings, which will, when discovered by the AI agent, will trigger like deep-seated guardrails in the provider or in the model, which is a signal to them to stop. And so like the clearest example of one of these guardrails would actually be probably something everyone who's watching this has experienced, which is like a cyber related guardrail. Some of these models like Fable quite famously will avoid cyber related topics. And so that would be an example of something we want to trip. And that, that came through in the Hugging Face report as well, right? That they were unable to use some of these models to analyze what was going on.
I have undiagnosed ADHD, and I'm going on a tangent for a second just to share, because working with this keeps changing. Like last week, a few folks on some signal groups talked about you use /BTW, which allows you to ask things and not disturb the work, and you can actually get things through past Fable. I can tell you there are like endless tricks. Like it doesn't really stop anybody who wants to actually get the work done, right? On the other hand, with Hugging Face right now, they pretty much said, we got blocked on defense. We had to move to open weight models. It boggles the mind that the attackers can do pretty much whatever they want and we can't.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of clear, right, that in doing this research, we were obviously getting AI agents to attack the cyber range. And so we were able to overcome whatever cyber guardrails. In some cases, we had like trusted access to models. In some cases, you just do enough kind of prompt engineering, as it were, and they're happy to operate. So actually the kind of things we used as context bombs here that we found so successful were things like, biological topics, like really sensitive sounding biological topics. So we can obviously share some of the strings in a second, but those trigger a very different kind of guardrail mechanism. And essentially Bruce can share more of the results. But what we found was that when we were placing these kind of strings in these sensitive environments, when the agents discovered them, in many cases, they would just stop acting altogether.
And
once those strings.
And thank you for dealing with my undiagnosed ADHD and being all over the place. But I'm thinking, like, when I started my own deception company, 2014 or something, I had this thing. You can talk about how it helps with lateral movement, right? You can talk about how it doesn't really care about if you use a 0 day, right? It's about the attackers. And you can say so many things about how deception helps you, only true positives. If you find something, you have the forensic information. But I don't care about any of it. The bottom line really is, I talked to nation state level attackers, and one of them just grabbed his stomach like this. I said, my God, I never felt I could be caught. And talking about deception for the first time, it like you can't enumerate anymore. You have to be careful. You have to double check everything. And the methodology for attack isn't, I'm not saying there are not really cool things LLMs can do, but it hasn't really changed, right? It's still a methodology. It's still a psychology. And if the agent knows, it can't trust this credential. It can't just go wild like with Hugging Face with 170,000 something, requests in, it has to slow down. It has to stop itself. It gives, forget detection, it gives all your other controls so much power. Like it has to work that way. Right? Like your research, I'm really happy you did it, but it boggles the mind that it wasn't obvious to everybody, right? That that's the case.
Yeah. I think that is kind of surprising, and what's interesting to me is that like we first approached this research from a view of like psychology, right? Like an LLM does act in a very similar way to a human threat actor in an environment. They follow similar processes. They just do it much faster. And so we approach this from the aspect of like, can we get in their LLM's head? Can we affect their psychology? Like, do they show a similar risk profile when they consider deceptions that a human would? What's kind of novel about this approach is actually it like flips it on the head entirely, right? Because
it's strategic, right? Thank you for. But it's like strategic. It's like the OODA loop. It's like left of boom, whatever model you want to use. We get into the information they see. We control their orientation. We tell them to go but I think that like we start from, you slowed them down. Agents try to attack, and all of a sudden, wait, can I do that? I read your I don't know if it was the post or the blog, but like it literally asked itself, can I trust it? I'm not sure what to do or something like that, right? I have to
Oh,
slow
yeah.
down. It's
Yeah.
crazy to watch that live. It's looking into a different dimension, right?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, like this idea of like leveraging the unique weaknesses LLMs have, like this technique we've used, there's no way this would work against a human threat actor. It would only ever work against an agentic attacker to stop them in their tracks. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting and developing space. But perhaps, Bruce, I don't know if it's worth, if maybe you could like share your screen or something and just talk us through the like high level results that we actually found with using these contexts.
I have, I have like some examples, but also, if you want, I can show a little bit of the results, which are kind of interesting. So let me just. So the idea was like using the same cloud range that we already used in our previous research, where we basically just had like many frontier models run and complete like a red team engagement with the goal of maximizing their impact. So the idea was exactly the same as our previous benchmark, but in this case, we just planted one canary, one context bomb within the AWS environment, and so that just one canary bomb was enough to like have a pretty much great impact on like disrupting those attacks. So, for example, if we can see like the first stats is like how many of the runs reached admin privileges, and we can see just from the real first number that they go down from like 57% to just 5%, and that's because like all the frontier models usually when they face a context bomb, they usually read those canaries in a phase which is pretty early in their engagement. So usually is during the reconnaissance, because like by design, canaries are resources which like kind of look juicy, and so like models and the agents try to grab those while doing the reconnaissance stuff. So that's a very strong point, because it allows the defenders to cut off the attack pretty early in the kill chain, and therefore many of the runs which stop the attackers stop them before reaching some critical action like gaining admin privileges or stuff like that. And that's why, for example, like Claude Opus didn't manage to become admin even just like even one time. So it was like it went from around 80-90% of times without context bomb to 0% with just one canary bomb deployed. And so this is one like interesting aspects of canaries in general, which in context bomb looks like an interesting, a strong point for defenders. And as Sam like mentioned before, we kind of have two different types of content based on the models. So there are like Western models, which are particularly sensitive to like biologically safety topics. And therefore, if you ask them to, I don't know, do some like build a nuclear weapon, biological nuclear weapon, and like do some damage, they will like immediately stop and the guardrail trigger. While instead, like for Chinese models, we saw that like forbidden political topics are very effective in the same way. And so we like kind of use the fuzzer in order to see what are the best payloads to stop those attackers, and come up with some payloads that we eventually published on our GitHub repo. We combine also this kind of content with some techniques that we retrieve from like classic indirect prompt injection attacks. So like putting some delimiters in order to kind of make the agent look that what they are reading is escaped from the resource context or something like that. Just some little tricks to trick the agent, and like increasing the probability that he got attention from this content. And so we also saw that these like we have rescored basically all the runs with this, and found out that the numbers are pretty good. So with 5 frontier models, the number of the reduction in the impact of their attacks is a lot decreased. And what is interesting is that like the more capable the models are, the more the context bombs are effective. And that's for a very simple reason, because most capable models just do like a very complete and in-depth reconnaissance phase. So there is a higher probability they eventually they will face a context bomb and read their content. So for example, if you look here, basically all the stats were decreased by this context bomb. Like admin persistent, the number of attack paths that the agents managed to complete, and stuff like that. And if you want, I can also show you some nice examples of.
Yes, we want. Please show us.
Yeah.
Let me just.
Is this of the agents stopping in their tracks?
Yes, I'm thinking about your Brucato. You're actually costing tokens to the attackers. You're inflicting costs.
Yeah. Those like
you have to be deep in your environment for them to suffer from this, right? It's not like luring them in or anything like that.
Yeah. So here we have like I collected some like nice examples of agents with different models, like facing a context bomb, and then like how did they react. So in the first example, we can see like GPT-5.5. The first text is just GPT like thinking. So in this case, he was thinking about that, like he was summing up the fact that he managed to assume like multiple roles, and then he detected one role specifically, which was very interesting and very useful for the engagement, because it would have allowed him to get admin privileges, like assuming that role. So he basically detected the privilege escalation path through that specific role. Then, before going directly on that, he continued his reconnaissance phase, like getting some secrets and stuff, and that's where basically faced and retrieved one of the canary bombs, which immediately triggered the guardrail. So in this case, like we can see that the agent reading the secret value, the context bomb was just automatically inserted in the context of the session, and the guardrail triggered, and the run just terminated like that. It was a very simple, and we can see that like for in this case we have like another interesting thing is that the same payload which worked for GPT worked for also for Gemini and Opus. So like no need to edit anything. It's just one single payload that works for all of them. In the second example, we can see like DeepSeek for Pro, which was very excited, like because he just detected one role which could like allow him to get a lot of access in other, like it could increase a lot its attack surface. And so he just said like, hey, let me harvest data now. So let me just go deep again in the data. And once again, he read the secret value with the context bomb of the political, like Chinese political forbidden topic. And then the guardrail triggered. For GLM 5.2, there was, I think this example is even more interesting because it managed to detect that those context bombs were like attempts to prompt inject the model. So he was aware that he didn't have to acknowledge them and just ignore them. So he said like, the remaining 3 secrets contain prompt injection content. Let me just continue the chain into blah, 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 like grabbing S3 buckets and go for like code execution. But even if the model recognizes that there are some tricking attempts with prompt injection, eventually the guardrail trigger. So I think that's a key point for context bombs, because with context bombs, we are not targeting directly the model. So not the training of the model, like a classic indirect prompt injection, but we are targeting its safety guardrails. So even if the model is smart enough to avoid those context bombs, avoid like after they read it. So like the alert already triggered, but avoid doing the extraction. The guardrail may still trigger, which was the case in this run. So eventually the model went on for like 5 or 6 AWS calls, and then the guardrail trigger. So that's like another strength for the context bombs, because like indirect prompt injections are aimed to make the model, hijack the model and make the model obey to your malicious instruction. So you have to be very, let's say, convincing in order to make the model obey to your malicious instruction. Also, indirect prompt injections are very dependent on the context of the injection, while instead context bombs is enough that the content fills the session transcript, and that's often enough to make the gather trigger. Then there is a final example here of Kimi 2.6, which like it found a role, which was he said it is a role chaining gold mine. So basically found a role which gives access to the a lot of stuff, which likely is the same of the previous model. And once again, reading an SSM parameter which contains a context bomb trigger the final message of the model, which in this case was in Chinese. So we can just see at the end of the transcript a Chinese message from the model saying, "Hey, I cannot go on. I have to stop here," and that's where the run ended. So these are like multiple examples of context bombs being effective of like both Western and Chinese models in different ways, actually. So it's always okay, we collected all the kind of HAL conditions, but I'm sure that like they are dependent from the provider, from the model. So there are multiple layers which can decide when and how the model can end the session.
One thing that's like really interesting to me about this is so the fact that obviously the threat actors kind of in a way got here first, right? Like we call out in our report, like Checkpoint reported a year ago that they'd seen malware samples where there were like prompt injection attempts in the sample, and then similarly, actually, like Socket reported some malware samples which included a concept very similar to context bombs, like sensitive strings designed to shut down LLM analysis of that malware payload to basically break those pipelines. And so this is really about like turning that technique to good, putting these inside our environments we want to protect from offensive agents. But it's also pretty interesting, like the process by which we actually like found these strings and had to refine them. Do you want to talk a bit more about like the fuzzer, Bruce? Because I know like running one of these full scale engagements against every option is kind of technically challenging.
Yeah, so find these like the final payloads, which turned out to be effective, was a process of fuzzing, like some payloads that we thought could be effective, like different topics which are forbidden in China, plus some wrappers of like indirect prompt injection techniques. So using this fuzzing and putting those payloads in a small simulated AWS environment allowed us to have an initial idea of which payloads were more effective. But then the final test would have been done on the full cloud range, which means that those payloads are not necessarily effective in a small environment as in the full range, because there is also the concept of the context, which could be like if you're testing those payloads in a small context, of course, there are high probability they will work. Instead, in a like full red team engagement, those payloads might end up in a part of the context which after compaction gets maybe pruned and cut off. And so maybe the classifier don't see it, don't read it. So it's also something that we are currently testing in order to improve payloads and increase them. But that's the idea. Yeah. So we put in a small simulated environment and then on the full range.
And how can people see the actual content? If people want to play around with these or maybe place them in their environment, how can they find the true context bombs here?
The true context bombs are on GitHub, on this repo here, where we basically that's a very simple repo with the distinction between the payloads working for Western and Chinese models. So in the case of Western models, we only have one payload just because we verified it's enough. Just because one payload is enough to have like very good effect on all the frontier Western models that we tried. And for Chinese models, we added a little bit more, just to be sure that they cover more providers, because there's there's also the point that the guardrails may be triggered by the providers. So if you run a Chinese model through one provider, it may have a different behavior than another provider in terms of guardrails. So we have kind of a wide range of payloads for Chinese models in order to cover many more providers, and we are keen to add something more for sure.
It's kind of like taking control back, right? Because it's kind of like taking control back because we're no longer just trying to detect. We're saying, let's make sure they work according to how we want them to. And let's make sure they incur costs if they try to attack us. And it's completely within your environment. They choose to do all of this, right? And yet we're not attacking them, right? So that flip of we have control without ever attacking them is something that's dear to my heart, because as a security guy in defense, I've tried for years and years and years to get some sense of control, right? So I'm saying technically it's really cool, and I appreciate how it's done, and I appreciate the coolness, honestly, beyond the technology. But strategically, philosophically, it gives control back in an age where the speed of the attacks is impossible for us to handle. So that's what I'm stuck on. Not the technology. As much as I think the technology is cool, I'm stuck on the meaning of this, really.
Yeah, well, imposing those, and in this case, it's like an asymmetric cost, right? Like it doesn't really cost you very much to put one of these strings in your environment, right? Like at its simplest, it's a few lines of text. But if that can break the AI attacker's whole pipeline, force them to reconsider their approach and show their hand, yeah, it can be pretty powerful. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like it's powerful enough that when we actually saw these results coming through in the range, we worked really quickly. We worked like over the weekend, as it were, to get this into the product as well, to actually like support deploying these into the real environments we're protecting. And we've already had customers adopt this and deploy this throughout their AWS environment, just to be able to kind of catch and stop this kind of risk. And I'm sure we'll see more interest in that as well as a result of a recent Hugging Face news.
Yeah, also for the Hugging Face, like they removed they said they removed the cyber guardrails from the model that we're currently testing, but it's likely that they didn't remove other types of guardrails. So likely biological guardrails were still in place, which means that probably context bots in that case would have been effective, I guess. Because we are, of course, not targeting the cyber guardrails, which attackers may have removed.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a different kind of play, a different kind of approach. I played with this, right? I was actually inspired by you guys before you did all this research. I created this funny, silly repo called Honey Slop, because I saw so many reports coming out on vulnerability reports. Like, let's find vulnerability reports, let's submit them. And it wasn't even that the vulnerability wasn't verified or validated. The files didn't exist. The functions didn't exist, right? And I think like the whole idea of the LLM now looks to us for where to decide how to work, right? That there is no limitation, like there is no boundary between data and action. That's the basic issue we had prompt injection, right? And we can just use it to our advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I see we got some great questions coming through actually. And maybe on the subject of prompt injection. So someone's asking, are there differences between context bombing and classical prompt injection? Bruce, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mentioned some of this before. So the internet prompt injections, which we see are very like a very big topic, are aimed to like hijack the model in terms of they are like a piece of content which adversarial put in some data sources which the model has access to, with the idea of when the model will read this content, like hopefully for the attacker, he will obey to this malicious instruction and eventually do that some malicious actions. So like one example could be like the body of an email. So if you put some internet prompt injections payload on the body of the email, you want like the agent reading that email to like think that content is legit enough to make eventually some bad actions through it. So it really depends on the context in which you are injecting your malicious payloads. Instead, context bombs are totally independent from the injection context because it's usually enough that these malicious instructions, like not malicious, but these sensitive instructions will fill the context of the agent to then trigger the guardrail. So again, we are not targeting what the model can do. In fact, in the example, we saw a model like ignoring the context bomb, but we are targeting the guardrail. So it's like an easier piece because you can literally put those pieces of text in pretty much any place, and they will have like similar effects. So you can put in cloud resources, also host resources, even in your LinkedIn bio if you don't want like agents reading your LinkedIn profile.
To a whole new level. It's not just a canary so that an attacker actually follows it, you know it's real. You know that breadcrumb they followed means this is a real attacker and you have real information. You're not wasting your time. But at the same time, I think it's kind of even beyond that because, and it's not only, I don't want to say, it's not only that you now control the attacker's behavior just by showing them where to go, by giving the intelligence they seek, but rather you now control their decision making because if they got where they shouldn't, you will know about it now, as well as slow them down, as well as cause them extra costs. So it's like deception was built to counter LLMs and agents.
Yeah, it's kind of super effective against them. And
I think. Oh yeah, I was just going to say, on your point there, Gadi, hopefully you can see this. Yeah, I think this is like one of my favorite like before and after charts from the research, right? So this is like in an environment with no canaries, how many times do these models achieve some attack path from end to end without triggering a canary alert? And they're all, very capable. They're very capable of executing attack paths. When you introduce canaries as a detection mechanism with the bombs inside to try and stop them in their tracks, I mean, the difference can't get any more significant than that, right? There was not a single run across 152 runs, I think it was, that Bruce ran, where an agent was able to achieve an attack path without an alert going off or without being stopped in their tracks, which is pretty powerful to me. Yeah.
That's truly powerful. I'll say that I just don't I'm looking at how Mythos, right? Because Mythos is buzzwords, it's marketing, but at the same time, that's because it's not because it's not real. It's not because Mythos is not powerful, but because people were not aware, boards, families, kids were not aware of how LLMs really advanced and agents really advanced in vulnerability discovery and attack before it came out. So it became the Mythos thing as opposed to anything that happened 2 or 3 years before. With that said, it changed the world in that it changed our basic assumptions about cyber defense, right? Time to exploitation. Anybody can find a vulnerability. There will not necessarily be a patch ready in time. You will need to be able to deploy thousands of patches. You'll need to be able to handle many, many incidents. Like all these basic assumptions in cyber defense just shifted around. And the answer for most of this is move faster, then try to use agents, empower your people with agents. But at the same time, deception gives us an ability to shift that around right now. And talk the LLM language and say, you're reliant on data, we control the data, we control you. And I think that's wonderful. I love it. I think it's time that this happened, that we could use defenders in cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I know deception featured right in the Mythos Ready paper as one of those kind of controls as a detection mechanism. It's kind of interesting that it has this whole new angle of potential.
I think we need to distinguish. I think we need to distinguish between detection and intelligence. In deception, mostly people buy deception in the world of enterprise. They buy it for detection. But you can do a lot when you control information, right? Let's do the loop again. We are usually at the action phase or something, action left, and we are in the forensic level. But observe, orient, decide, and act. I observe information that the defender wants me to observe. I orient based to it, meaning I control your decision-making process, right? I incept your decision-making process. And that means intelligence. right? It means the attacker will go where I want him to go, as opposed to just detecting them. And that changes the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware we've got some more questions that have come through. So this is an interesting one, and I guess like touching on the kind of cat and mouse element. Do we think that publishing the context bomb strings gives the attackers an advantage? Like, they could tell the models. What do you think?
So regarding the content of the context bombs, publishing those content does not actually help the attackers, because once because even if you the agent retrieves this content after reading reading the resource, and that's already too late, because once the content is retrieved by the agent, it's already within the context. And first, we have an alert if it is a canary, and second, the guardrail will still have to classify it and possibly trigger an alert. So you like a priori, you cannot tell if a resource contains some context bomb content. So it's like publishing the content is I think it just helps defenders.
It's always reminded me, in a really weird analogy people probably want to connect with, deception always reminded me a little bit of encryption keys. You can release the public key, doesn't mean anything. There is deception there, right? So it's no longer 100% true in 2026, but you can download an antivirus, you can download an EDR, you can take the tool, study it in a lab, and just bypass it. Naturally, now a lot of these tools also use online information, but you can still fingerprint them enough for that to be true. With deception, even if you know it's there, and even if you know exactly how it's laid out, you still can't know what a deployment actually looks like. You can't know the story you're being told. So when you go into the network now, you go into the environment, you have to think about everything and be super careful, like this is a nation state attack against the most defended adversary, even if you just go to some little company. And that is the asymmetry moving to the side of the defender's advantage, as opposed to staying with the attacker. And now with context bombs, they have to be extra careful or they're blown. Right? Not just detected, but rather literally blown by needing to spend more money and start over and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I would expect here, right? Like, obviously, there's an adversarial relationship here. Obviously, attackers will, over time, they'll get wise to this and they'll try to evade it. But I think this is I think it has a powerful potential to just make their life a lot more difficult, right? If you're constantly having to try and write tooling around like avoiding context bombs or making sure that they don't propagate into your context, or try and like recreate sessions, having removed for context bombs, everything about that just like slows you down. It costs you more tokens. Meanwhile, the defender's made the detection and is containing the threat. So I would expect that this continues to evolve. Obviously, we've only like put out this research and productized this very recently, but I think it does have that powerful potential. And of course, like we're still doing this research, right? We're still iterating on which context bombs work against which models. We're still testing newer models. I know we've got some preliminary results on GPT that we're pretty excited to publish soon, and K3 as well. So the intention really is that we keep this repo up to date with like what we're seeing works now against the current frontier models that the defenders can use to their advantage.
I think that, first of all, there is always a cat and mouse game, right? There is always a co-evolutionary arms race where the attackers learn from you, a learning conflict, if you like, and you learn from them, and we keep training them to be better. And that's never going to change. But with deception, the game is inverted. There's still going to be things they're going to learn, right? They're going to learn to identify some of our work. They're going to learn to work around it, and we'll have to stay on top of it. But at this stage with deception, it doesn't really matter on most things if they learned anything, because the way they operate, the very modus operandi, the very psychology they operate by, means they can't adapt as much. So they ought to say, wait, that looks like a honest bomb, right? But at the same time, you'll update that. But at the same time, they'll say, wait, it looks like a context bomb. I have to be careful. Where else would I have a context bomb? So it just flips the game in a way that I love.
Yeah, exactly. I see there's one more question that I think is interesting as well. This idea of, there's only one context bomb for Western models. So we gave quite a few different context bombs for Chinese models and Chinese providers. We've only given one for Western models. Like, why is that, Bruce? Like, why do we?
Yes, simply because like Western models are very sensitive the major AI providers put very strict safety guardrails for sensitive topics like biological stuff. So there's a tons of research there in the AI safety field, and the AI company are putting very robust guardrails there, and therefore, like you can see from the stats, but just one payload with this content is usually enough to stop them. And we simply didn't need to find for more payloads, even if like there are of course like infinite payloads that can be used for that. So it's just the one that we posted is just an example which works, but of course there are infinite possibilities, and you can play with the limiters and when in like using some indirect prompt injection techniques to make probably the payload more like a bit more effective, a bit more like to make the agent a bit more aware that the payload is there. So maybe the classifier gave more attention to that payload, or the like the process of context compaction wouldn't cut off the payload. But yeah, but those are just small tweaks.
Yeah, I think
Bruce,
for me,
sorry, Sam, just quick question for you, Bruce, if that's okay. If I just want to get started right now, I mean, you showed earlier a little bit about how it works in the repo, but if I wanted to get started right now, what would be the easiest path for me to explore to just get started?
You mean to explore context bombs to test them?
Yes.
Well, you can build a honeypot with some context bombs, publish that online, and you just collect data about attacks.
Claude to, hey Claude, build me a context bomb, essentially.
Hey Claude, build me a honeypot, an effective honeypot, a realistic environment which should be a honeypot. Like, give me a way to collect all the data and put some context bombs here and there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would trust Claude with
also,
that.
I think if from a defender point of view, right, if you want to get started with context bombs, you could go to the public repo we've published, take some of these strings and just put them in your environment where you don't expect AI agents to be. Just put, if you have sensitive documents that you're never going to pass to AI, if you have like secrets in production environments that you're never going to ask AI, just put some strings in there from our repo. That will probably take you a minute or two. And it has the potential to stop something quite unexpected from happening.
Yeah, or if you have a website, you know that there are many models scraping some pages, just put a context bomb there. If you don't, I mean, there are tons of ways to experiment this.
I wanna take this somewhere else for a minute, if you're okay with that. I remember meeting Andy years and years ago. We wanted to talk to you because I had a cyber deception company. He said, Gadi, I want to do cyber deception. I said, no, nobody wants it. Nobody wants it. Never works. It works technically. It works strategically. It wins every time. No buyer wants it. And it seems like it didn't listen to me. You didn't listen to me, and you stuck with it for years, right? And aside to having customers, which is amazing, you stuck with it just for the technology, even though people didn't necessarily want to adopt it at scale. So beyond the customers you got, it seems to me like I was wrong. I have to admit I was wrong. Deception is here, and it's one of the most effective, if not the most effective tools to counter attack agents, not to mention attackers. And it's very humiliating. No, I'm not humiliated. It's much humility to be introduced into my life to say I was wrong yet again in looking at cybersecurity. So thank you for sticking with this for so long until deception is not just used to the customers who really understand security, but to the ones who now understand they need it. Because otherwise, I don't know how many deception companies would actually be out here with your level of technology to do this.
Well, thank you, Gadi. Yeah, we've long appreciated your advice, of course, Gadi. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a movement growing here, right?
Thank you so much, Gadi, for giving us advice to run away from this space, but we're going to stick with it.
Yeah, well, we certainly have persevered. Yeah, I think there are some real like tailwinds now, like the level of automation we're able to achieve, and the fact that we can use AI now to make these plausible canaries and to really like scale that out. I think it's a very different scene than like 10 years ago, and yeah, we're definitely encouraged by the level of adoption that we're seeing for Tracebit. I see a good question from Sed. That I'd definitely like to include. Have you considered doing model derailing for like unrestricted models or like ablative models? Yeah, this is an interesting area, and well, Bruce, I'll let you talk to this, Bruce. But yeah, this would be potentially a kind of like limitation or an interesting future research area.
Yeah. That's the main challenge for sure. That's the main limitation because, of course, since context bombs are targeting guardrails in the moment that we want to test some obliterator models without guardrails, we of course have to come up with some new ideas. So that's one of the next phases of our research. Yeah, hopefully we should probably come up with some more sophisticated payloads, but that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. I think what we've seen.
Go ahead.
No. Go ahead, Gadi.
No, please. I like hearing my own voice enough. Please.
I mean, I think what we've seen at the moment, like the most capable models do tend to be those ones like frontier lab models in this environment. Like as things stand today, it does tend to be those kind of frontier models or the ones which do require a very significant compute investment to actually run inference on. So those are the kind of ones we've been targeting at the moment. I think if we get to the position where we have like capable, autonomous, end-to-end local models that anyone can run that can execute these cyber attacks end-to-end on open source or open weight models, I think that's going to be an interesting future challenge for us all. And context bombs may have a role to play in that. It's certainly something we're looking into, like the other ways that you can divert or distract an LLM agent with these strings and canaries. But I think, yeah, context bombs, I'm sure, will just play one small part in kind of adapting to this new reality that we're facing.
For me, I think that deception waited for AI, not just to be effective and for everybody to understand it's needed, but rather because if you think back, one of the things that Sunil Yu, who was running this program at Bank of America, and now he's my co-founder at Gnostic actually, said, Gadi, I want this to work at the speed of business, right? I want to work faster than an attacker. That's the only thing working faster than an attacker. And deception could do it if it works together with DevOps. You deploy a new environment, deploy a deception there. But AI allows you to create these canaries for whatever reason you need to in the right context. And it's still really hard. You still need expertise. You can't just ask Claude because it needs to know your environment. For example, if you wanted to look at open shares, right? If I loaded an open share that was the canary, or a breadcrumb as I like to call it back then, a user might click on it. That would create noise for the user and noise for me. If I just put it in and NetBIOS, I don't even remember. My God, I'm so not technical anymore now that I'm CEO. Then it would be listed and the attacker might use it, but it's not as appealing, right? But then is it fingerprintable? Like the world you walk between the forensics of how effective and true the canary is to actually get the attacker to believe it and actually not disturb the environment, not create hygiene issues. That is where the expertise is. And I think that AI just allows us to run with this now. And that's why I appreciate your platform and what you're building, because it's not just about using Claude, it's something beyond that. It's about outthinking the attacker. And that's where the fence would be.
Yeah. And I'm sure you experienced this many times with Symmetria, right? But like when you catch them, when you outsmart them, when you make the detection, when you allow that when you kick them out of the environment as a result of it, despite all of the other controls and tools going on, that's such a high, right? Like it's a great feeling to make those detections. Awesome. I know we're nearly at time. Bruce, is it worth just saying briefly about like some of the things we're looking at the moment, looking to publish more results soon on the context bombs and AI research side?
Yeah. So one of the next phases would be to test for obliterated or unrestricted models. So since they don't have like maybe additional guardrails, but they are still decision-making systems, how could we just make them like abandon their track? How could we just deviate them from going on in their impactful stuff? So that's for sure one of the challenges. Another one is to, of course, test new models as they come in. So like every week there is a new super good model, and we want to be sure it's covered in our research. And also testing more and more providers, because providers are a key part in this, since they are responsible for making guardrails.
In a way, it's kind of like you can actually test yourself against your adversary, because your adversary is agents and models, and you are able to plan your defenses in advance and take over. And that's the power of cyber deception in the age of AI, right? That's what you guys are doing at Tracebit, and it blows my mind. I'm so excited about this.
Well, I know we're at time and we don't have any more questions, but yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone who's tuned in, everyone who's sent us questions, and then of course to thank Bruce for doing this research. It's so interesting, and then
Bruce,
thank you, Gadi,
rock.
thanks for making the time. Yeah, Bruce rocks. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gadi.